Good afternoon and welcome to Africa Update, reaching from our studios here in Abuja, Nigeria's capital. This is another episode of looking at what's happening on the African continent. To stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Africa Update. I'm your host, Chiamaka Nwafor. This week we have something happening, actually taking place today over in the southern part of the continent in South Africa, Johannesburg precisely. It's called the G20 Summit. Earlier, 2 weeks ago, we discussed a look into the G20. What do we expect? And now we're going to be talking about more expectations with what's been happening on that front. Let's take a look at this story. But, remember that America is saying they will not attend the G20 summit, and this report has more information on that. To stay with us.
As Johannesburg gears up to host this weekend's G20 summit of rich and developing nations, the US has once again said that it won't participate. On Thursday, the White House responded to comments by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa that Washington had changed its mind. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that the US would send a diplomatic delegation to the handover ceremony at the end of the event, but won't participate in talks. US President Trump has cited his claims that South Africa is violently persecuting the country's white Afrikaner minority farmers as the reason for the US boycott. Those claims have been widely rejected. President Ramaphosa has insisted that the summit will issue a joint declaration, despite pressure from Washington not to do so. Ramaphosa said he regretted America's absence, but insisted that those participating in the summit will not agree to be bullied.
Now, joining me to further discuss is Dr. Sam Amadi. He's a lawyer and a public policy analyst. Also, he's the director of the Abuja School for Social and Political Thought. He's joining us virtually from Abuja. Good day. Thank you for joining us on the program this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's go into the G20. There's so much, conversations around it. Trump saying he's not coming, and from that story we just heard, there's still the "we're not coming, we're going to send a delegation." First of all, what do you make of this stance by the United States concerning the G20 summit?
Well, for many, if before Trump came to power, it would be, perhaps this would not happen. Even if there were diplomatic and political differences and issues between the U.S. and South Africa, it wouldn't lead to boycott of G20 and the forum of leading economies and some of the upcoming economies in the third world, which usually provide opportunity for integrative discussions around sustainable development and democracy. As a special advisor in foreign ministry, I had accompanied President Yar'Adua to one of such meetings in Rome. And I do know Obama then was in power, and the American president came, usually to espouse. And so it's usually something that's perhaps not usually contemplated. But this is Trump's America, and things change quite quickly. Trump's argument has been that South Africa is guilty of genocide against white farmers, which South Africa has rejected, denied, provided argument that if there are issues around its national laws and dealing with issues of equity and development. So here we are, the U.S. finally boycotting, which is unusual. And the question then is, if America is not at the G20 in terms of where America stands today in the world, how useful would be the deliberation? So we figured it out when the event finally happens.
Okay, so now they said they're not going to be there at all. They're only going to be there because they're supposed to take over from South Africa. So they'll be there at the end of the summit. And you just made a very valid point in question. How useful will be these deliberations that are about to happen in this summit if one of the major players in the world and on the G20 is not present? Will these submissions and these commitments, will they be binding?
Well, it depends on the work commitment is reached. But by the way, the G20 is not usually a legislative assembly. It doesn't make rules in that multilateral sense. Perhaps we'll see from the COP30 or COP28, COP whatever. The Conference of Parties are much more legislative. So the G20 is more of a deliberative assembly, high level. Maybe they reach some consensus or agreement, which is later translated into a much more binding legislative document. So, but the point is that the issues that usually come up for discussion and may come up issues around climate change, around global growth, around democracy, it will not depend on whether the US likes the outcome, because they're not going to be part of shaping that discussion. They'll come at the end to just receive, the baton, so to say. But so it bears then on what the issues are, what issues are reached, and whether it's the type that will favor Washington, because Trump has shown that the US is not reluctant to walk away from discussions or agreements that he considers perhaps more favorable to it. So it all depends on how skillfully the leading countries in that discussion will be mindful and factor in US sensibilities, even if the US top officials are not there to deliberate. So all will depend still uncertainty around the nature of the discussions and how post the forum, what these leaders do and how they engage President Trump, and perhaps message him around the core commitments arising from the meeting.
All right, we'll go back to some of the things that are going to be discussed in the G20, but let's still staying with attendance. We have seen some people begin to arrive for this summit. We are seeing from a video that Malaysia has shown its face at this event so far. Now, about 42 countries and organizations have confirmed participation, including the 20 G20 members, of course, with the United States absent. Now, 16 invited guest countries and 6 regional blocs representing Africa, the Caribbean, and East Asia. Heads of major international organizations, including the UN, IMF, World Bank, AU, and WEF, World Economic Forum, are also present. Now, most delegations are led directly by heads of state or government. However, 4 countries, Russia, China, Mexico, and Argentina, are not sending their presidents. China is being represented by Premier Li Qiang, while Russia by senior officials and others by high-ranking ministers. Now, South Africa's presidency is clarifying that this is not a snub. Dr. Sam Amadi, we're seeing these people are arriving, and these 4 countries, Russia, China, major players, Mexico and equally Argentina, are not going to be sending, their heads of states are not coming. South Africa is saying it's not a snub. What do you make of that?
I think somewhere it's not really. I mean, look, South Africa took Russia, took Israel to the ICC, which some believe is a fallback, part of the issues driving the U.S. hostility to South Africa, as we saw with Trump and Becky and the Prime Minister a couple of months ago. Maybe Russia, even though they are in good state with South Africa diplomatically, not like the US now, they might also, the Russian president might not want to come down to Africa or to a country like South Africa, where you can say some kind of a liberal country that is very strong on ICC and strong on UN resolutions. So don't forget that there could be a possibility also of some kind of attempt to arrest or to confront. So that might be one. China, maybe a lot less focusing more on its own diplomatic priorities. China is playing big in Africa, but China has not been very political in terms of showing forth. They are more economic. They follow the trade and investments. And the Chinese leader has not really considered stepping into Africa as core priority. So those two might, in some way, downgrade the event at the level of sending top-level officials. Obviously, America is not coming. Argentina has tied with America more often in diplomatic issues, certainly, especially with the bailout coming from Trump and the charming relationship between Mr. Trump and the new Prime Minister, the President of Argentina. So, in a sense, these absentees have something to do with either a sense of lack of security in South Africa, a sense of maybe expected hostility or hostile reception, or fear of some diplomatic outcome, or really politics, downgrading the event itself. So in a sense, these are not good optics. See, the two major economies in the world, China and the US, are not coming at the highest level. And America is not coming at all. And Argentina is perhaps downgrading attendance, and Russia. It speaks to, it doesn't necessarily totally devalue the conference, the meeting, but in a sense, it stars, it's like a small dent on the profile of the meeting.
Okay, let's now go to the issues that are going to be talked about, that have been set, that will be talked about in this summit. Now, most of the issues are Africa related, Africa concerned, debt sustainability, climate finance, cost of capital, we'll get to that, AI governance, SME growth, critical minerals, and illegal financial flows. All these issues are mostly, Africa related, Africa based. Now let's talk about cost of capital. A committee was established and it's mostly to investigate why developing countries, especially African economies, face extremely high borrowing costs. These issues, do you believe and think that discussing mostly Africa-connected, Africa-related issues at the G20 summit will actually have an effect and will actually help push the African agenda and bring some sort of a relief to the continent?
I think it's important that these issues have been discussed. I mean, every forum that Africa issues have to discuss perhaps is helpful. But the drawback is that it's not going to translate to much in terms of reliefs, in terms of solutions, except Africa
gears up to host this weekend's G20.
So my view will be this. In spite of what happens with these discussions, they probably will throw up some good insights. Africa, what happens at the level of AU? What happens at the level of various peer review mechanisms in the continent? What happens at the level of various regional framework associations and platforms for action matters more for development in the continent than what happens at this high level, policy deliberative forum. Yes, they are very important. Yes, some experts perhaps provide some insights, and maybe the countries make some commitments, which we may see some down payments down the line. But really, in terms of what will make Africa get move strategically and forward and consistently, you have to bank on what the African governments do, what they do at the level of the AU and the regional governments and regional unions, and then what the various social civil society, technocratic, business fora and forums in Africa do. So we have to domesticate this conversation, and we have to deepen them. We have to, a proceduralized conversation, so that you are picking the pieces, you are fixing things, you are revising things. So these conversations will not change the game in Africa. They could offer us some help, some illumination, some insights, and perhaps, help to bend and tilt the global institutions of economic development and social development to support Africa's collective, strategic, and integrated efforts.
Now, there's an inequality report that's coming out by Joseph Stiglitz. And do you think that report will anyway have any impact, in a permanent global panel or in the balance? We're talking about inequality here. And of course, we're not saying that it will come to a place whereby we have equal footing, but where there's some sort of balance or some sort of equality. How well do you think that the African continent is going to be able to get there with the rest of the world, or better still, the developed countries, global South, global West, the Western countries rather?
Yeah, sure. I think Joseph Stiglitz has earned the reputation and the profile of a consistent defender of a more equitable economic development. I mean, he's done a great job. His writings, his tenure as World Bank chief economist, his tenure perhaps as economic advisor to American president, he has been consistent. And again, these reports will perhaps add to the several he has co-authored. He has co-authored a lot of work on African economics and economic development, and they'll be helpful. But look, Stiglitz himself will admit that a real shift happens when countries and perhaps continents and sub-regions, engineer strategic, smart, and bold measures to leverage on international economics, international capital structure, which is what perhaps this kind of report talk about. The report talk about maybe how to help Africa with balanced trade, fair trade. Okonjo-Iweala, maybe you'll be at that place and talk more about fair trade. Maybe to talk about how to help Africa with access to capital. Maybe some of the disruptive technologies coming up, issues around balancing growth and climate change management. Some of the insights and the call for a more global resource and commitment to helping Africa will be helpful. But really, the real change maker here, as it was in Asia and Europe and America in centuries of economic convergence, is what the leadership institutions at the African level do to maneuver away from backwater of economic growth. So yes, Stiglitz report to be helpful, conversations to be helpful. The key thing is how these leaders, how sincere they are, how African leaders are smart and insistent and bold and transmitted themselves. At the moment, the African continent does not inspire confidence, and there's probably not much seriousness in the African leadership currently.
We're going to go on a short break, and when we return, the conversation. Welcome back from that short break on the program. Still with us is Dr. Sam Amadi, lawyer and public policy analyst, speaking to us on the G20 summit. Now, Doctor, one of the issues is our critical minerals. We see what's happening in different parts of the continent, here in West Africa, over in East Africa, with the lithium, very important, the diamonds, the gold. How can Africa, because it's a conversation on the table at the G20 summit, but how can we help ourselves become, that we enjoy these things, not just exporting raw materials, that we could equally process it, and now, the finished product, how do we benefit from this?
Well, clearly, Africa started life as a colony and basically dependency, sending minerals, raw materials to Europe and America. And Africa has continued. And so the primary question will be, how will African countries make that transition to become value adders, to move from leverage on their raw material, of course, in the short term, get the best price they can, maintain fiscal stability in the export market, but move to manufacturing, move to value addition and earn more, because that's one. Two, again, some kind of justice around natural resource management. The Chinese are in with illegal bunkering, with criminality, and then, of course, this is now a source of instability and conflicts, even wars in Africa, and military rule, military overthrow of civilian government. So the stakes are high now. Not just that mineral resources, natural endowments are creating poverty for Africa, but they're also now creating instability, creating conflict, endemic conflicts that lead back to much more aggressive poverty. So the three levels of the conversation will be, how do we ensure that we protect this African resource management in a way that it's not exploited by foreigners who now are source to us conflict and violence? And two, how do we ensure that we get fair pricing for these resources? And more importantly, how do this continent be helped to now become, manufacturers, industrialize, move from just exporting these raw materials to exporting, finished goods, exporting value-added goods, and earning more and escaping poverty. So the odds are high, and that's a very big point. And I would like to see how the major economic powers, reflect on this.
All right. Now, one question, last question on this conversation. Is how do you think this summit so far will help turn the economic situation to where the global South, in favor of global South priorities, that is, of course, us here, African continent, how do you think this G20 summit will actually do that for us?
Well, this is an opportunity to make the case and make it stronger and make it perhaps more persuasive. One. Two, perhaps best outcome, these countries live with renewed commitment to do more for Africa and perhaps change their rules, both internal issues, rules of migration, rules of international assistance, and so on and so forth, rules of the market in their domestic countries and the WTO framework and other the multilateral in trading and financial frameworks. If they go out, they can go home with a greater commitment to change the rules, to make the rules fairer to Africa. But ultimately, it falls back again to Africa. So the conversation, the ideas during it, are we going to be able to now use them to engineer stable polity? Because except Africa moves away from endemic crisis, conflicts around, access to power, a bit of resources. If we can't get away from the conflicts of religion and ethnicity and the killings and the destructions, and then all these rhetorics at any other forum or this forum will not help us much. So the hope is that the world powers go home with their conscience a little bit more pricked, and they're willing to make the rules fairer, willing to make more commitments to Africa in terms of maybe IDAs, international development assistance, and they're willing to open their markets, which is very important, to African exports and African, semi-finished goods and African, tradables. That's really what, would be the best outcome. Okay,
now, we are done with G20, and I'm going to ask you a question in less than 30 seconds because our time is up. Guinea-Bissau elections starts tomorrow up until for a week. November 30th is when it ends. What's your expectation? What's the outlook we have for them?
Well, not a good one. If you look at the history of that country in terms of elections, 2019, election cancelled, postponed, tenure overrun, and so on and so forth. At a point, the leaders went to G20, I think, and never came back and postponed elections. So we hope that this will be maybe less acrimonious. The parliament and the president executive branch elected, fair pools. End of the day, the country deserves a break, and then they can restart with a much more certain and definite leadership.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sam Amadi, for your insights on our conversations today on Africa Update. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
And that's it for our program this week. I hope you've been able to have insights on the happenings on the continent. Same time, same place next week. I'm your host, Chiamaka Nwafor. Bye for now.